to thank Franz Davidson and Paige Hodsman for inviting me to the conference to share some of my research findings and experiences. And this has been quite a conference. This is wonderful. I did mention to Franz and Paige last night that I'm going back to my hotel room and rewriting my presentation, so no one's seen this yet. How can I best impact you? With the honor of being the closing keynote, how can I tie the conference together? Because obviously with the workplace sector, with the healthcare and educational sector, there's overlap. So what can we take away? Well, I thought I'd share some of my findings. So we're going to share some how I've connected the dots in my mind in the past day and a half of how there are similarities here and how that translates to me specifically. As a change management consultant, my firm is working with organizations that are going through physical workplace change, but we also do that for the office environment of healthcare institutions. We also do that for the office environment of educational institutions. So this has been very, very helpful to me. So one of the things I learned was hearing about job-related depression, stress, absenteeism, and job dissatisfaction. Thank you, Sarah. She was describing an emergency department. Well, I would say that for many people working in the corporate office environment, they feel like they're in the emergency department as well. So they're suffering with some of these same symptoms. We heard about learning versus teaching, user control of the environment, where Me was talking about children actually partitioning off the space. It was up to them to create that right environment. Well, we know that user control is typically one of the goals for corporate office environment change, that you want to put the control in the hands to easily change your environment rather than calling facilities department or a furniture dealer. However, many adults act like children in the work environment, so there's a correlation there. We also want to thank Alex in talking about healing environments to promote independence, a place that people can enjoy, progressive privacy, appropriate intellectual and sensory stimulation. In the business environment with office environments, we want employees, and when I say employees, that's everyone from the individual contributor to the CEO. We want people to be independent. We want them to make choices over where they're working within their environment, if indeed that's what the workplace strategy is. But what could get in the way? We'll talk about privacy because that's one of the hot issues. Nicole mentioned social isolation, loneliness, and depression. Well, that was in reference to elderly care facilities, but I would say if we're having a more open office environment that's more collaborative, it should be the opposite of this, yet people want to hang on to their isolated space. So it's a little bit of a mismatch to me. We should be promoting some of the opposite effects when we're talking about the open office environment. Kirsten talked about the impacts of pleasant versus unpleasant sounds. And I would venture to say she went into great depth, but I walked away with 3 words: chaotic, boring, and uneventful. I think a lot of employees would have described their workday in that same way. We need to change that. And then lastly, Diane, I want to answer your question. Do people complain about noise because they miss some privacy? Yes. They also complain about the noise because they've given up their cubicle and they wanted to have their place where they could put the family pictures. They also complain about noise for a number of other reasons, the relationship with their managers. When people are going through change and they're against it, they're going to lash out at something. It's often the acoustics. So a little bit about background in terms of my firm's research study really began 19 years ago, looking at the impact of physical space on behavior, and specifically about resistance to workplace change. So over this period of time, my firm has studied and worked with over 140 organizations. I intentionally wanted to look at as many industries as possible, because if you're in an industry, you tend to think that no other organization could be like yours. So, gee, we're in the financial institution, so nobody knows what it's like for that pressure. And, you're in the manufacturing environment, in the office environment again. You couldn't know our problem. So there's a lot of similarities we found through this research. And now we're applying it to organizations all over the world. What was uncovered over this period of time is what have come to be called the critical influences. So 15 factors, some of them tangible, some of them intangible, but these factors have been proven time and again in all these different industries that can get in the way of us accepting workplace change. Now you'll see in the lower right-hand corner the physical and virtual workplace. If the actual workplace design is not the appropriate one, then obviously it's going to be hard for people to accept that change. Acoustics is going to fall into that area, as would lighting, elements that create that healthy environment. But even if you get that right, the design is correct, the acoustical treatment is correct, these other 14 factors can get in the way. Now, this would be like a 17-week course. We're not going to go there, but let me just make a couple of examples. Right in the middle, you see leadership behavior. This is an element that appears on every single client project we have. You hear the expression, probably overused, you need to walk the talk. Well, leaders need to adopt the same work behaviors expected of the rest of the workforce. And if they don't, it's going to be hard to trickle down that message, because they're going to be seen as being exclusive. Technology is a natural. Just chatting with someone during one of the breaks that, moving to an activity-based work setting, and people were encouraged to move around throughout the day, yet they didn't have laptops. So they were tethered to their desk. To me, that's a natural one. Communication. It's so critical. It's not just communicating workplace change once, it's reinforcing, it's tying into the business case, it's helping people understand that communications is ongoing through workplace change. One element that is usually a little more difficult for people to understand is rewards and consequences. And I think the example I like to use is tied to activity-based work settings. If I am an individual contributor in an organization and I have the freedom to use different spaces, I may be in an open benching system at one point in the day, and then I know myself, I know my energy levels, I know my deadlines, and I'm a very dedicated employee. Well, I'm going to go and find a focus booth or a quiet room, you may call them different things, and I'm going to go in there to work on my report. So I'm going to be in there for an hour. I'm going to get it done and be very proud of myself that I've met my deadline. Well, when I leave that focus booth or small, quiet area and walk back out to the open environment, if my supervisor says, "Gee, Diane, how was your nap?" And we hear this all the time. Those kinds of questions, eventually, that consequence of me using the space that was designed for me, that what the company invested in for me to have a place like that, I'm not going to use it. I'm not going to use that space. I'm going to get ridiculed. So those kinds of things can get in the way of our ability to accept, understand, and adopt new ways of working. A number of years ago, I was sharing some of my research findings, not unlike today, and John Wiley & Sons Publishing was in the audience and asked me if I would compile my research findings in a book. And after I, came to after I fainted, I said, "Yeah, right." Today, the book is being used by by universities as textbooks and reference books on 6 continents, ranging from Harvard University's Graduate School of Design to the University of Tasmania. I did not verify that one. They told me that's where the book is. So I'm very humbled by the fact that these findings are being acknowledged and recognized to be significant to helping people, actually change their work behaviors. Today, Stegmeier Consulting Group is an outshoot of that research. We've been in business for 13 and a half years. We live and work in an open office environment, and we call it a work laboratory. Our office space was built in the late 1800s, which in the US, that is very old. I realize you're laughing. That's very old. But we have free address. People do not have assigned spaces. We experimented with different heights of screens to understand, where can you feel like you're not being distracted and interrupted. You'll also see on the desk corners, and I've got it in an elevated version there, an expanded version, we have 3 simple blocks at each workspace. And the way we work is that if you are available for your colleagues to interrupt you, to ask a question, to ask for some help, you put your green block out, green for go. If you're able to be interrupted for something, that's really more serious, yet you're up against more of a deadline, you put the yellow out. You can come to me if you need help with work, but I don't want to talk about the sports game. I don't have time for that. The red block is out when it's crunch time. Absolutely, no one's going to interrupt me unless the building's on fire. So we have an amazing team and an amazing space, and we see this in our space as well as in client locations. Open office environments are often some of the most quiet, peaceful environments. Just the opposite of what people think. But we like to confuse people. How many different ways do we describe new ways of working in the changing work environment? It's no wonder that companies get so nervous. It's good for us because they call us in as change management consultants, but try to sort through this. So, a question for the audience. Which commonly used term provokes more debate in the workplace today than any other? Open space. Open space. The open plan, open office, open work environment, the phrase may be a little different. When we get a call from a new client that says, we need help, we're moving to an open office environment, we just told our employees about it, we need help. Well, first of all, I'd like to take the word open out of the dictionary because it's like you're just setting yourself up for so much anxiety. And in fact, one time we walked into a new client for the kickoff meeting, and they said, well, gee, one of our employees just brought an article to share with the project team. The open office is the work of Satan. It's like, that was the time when we get all sorts of strange articles. But it's like, oh my gosh, so laughing about that one. But employees are going to find ways to try to sabotage the changing work environment. We see that some of the concerns are legitimate. Distraction, lack of privacy. We hear that all the time. But I would ask, what does a productive workplace sound like? Do we assume that a quiet, peaceful, calm environment is the most productive? Well, yeah, if you're doing individual focus work. But what if you're responsible for working on a team or maybe 2 or 3 teams and you've got a matrix reporting structure in that? It's more of an environment that's energetic, enthusiastic. There's laughter. That's not an unproductive environment. So having a balancing act of that and having a numerous work settings from which to choose, so if you need the quiet, you have it. If you need a more vibrant environment, you can find that as well. Yet, people think that when their organization's moving to a more open environment, that it is like a 3-ring circus. Of course, this office they're envisioning has no columns, no space dividers. It's like a circus tent. So you've got the movement, you've got light, you've got sound. And how could I ever work in an environment like that? People lose sleep over worrying about moving to an open office environment. And did I say that my firm does not design space or build buildings? We're only helping people through whatever the decision the client has made. A lot of times it's the open office environment. She's got her fingers in her ears. Is that because it's a loud environment, or is she standing there's like, this will go away if I just don't look and don't listen to anything? It's not going to go away, but we can help employees dispel the myths of the open plan. There is some reality in some of the perceptions. People need to understand that there's a kernel of truth there. Yeah, it could be more noisy. But what are some of those ways that we can help? One thing is to help people understand the evolution of work processes. In the past, so much work was paper-based. The work process was linear. So if I'm working on a project, when I got done with it, I would hand it to the next person. They'd work on it, and then down the line until whatever the deliverable was finished. Now we're working in teams more and more. It's not the exception. It's more the rule. Secondly, what are our expectations of our individual workspace? Because in the past, if I had a large cubicle or a large private office, I had every single thing I need for every single scenario. I had the guest chair in case my colleague needed to talk to me. I had plenty of space to display family photos. I had a little refrigerator in there and a heater. I just live in that space. Well, now we're shrinking the footprint. People are in smaller spaces, maybe assigned, maybe unassigned, but people need to understand that you can get all those elements in different spaces. You've got that freedom to move around, to find a place to sit down, to talk to your colleague. What is our definition of interruption? We hear this all the time. I'm going to be interrupted in the open office environment. It's going to be terrible. It's going to be terrible. Well, how many times do we allow ourselves to be interrupted? I don't care if you're in the private office with the door closed. We're working on something and, beep. Oh, I got a text message. You stop and you look at that. That reminds you of something else. You go online, you check something else. And, 50 minutes later, you realize that you didn't get your work done. Often we can blame ourselves. We need to be able to focus better. Cultural implications. I'll just tie that back to the example earlier about me being an employee that would go and work in a quiet area and come out and my boss says, "How was your nap?" Culture plays a huge part in the acceptance of workplace change. And lastly, the impact of leadership behavior. If the change starts at the top and leaders are going to embrace the change and adopt the new work behaviors themselves, it's much easier than when the leaders feel that they are excluded from any of the new roles. So we want to bridge the gap between perception and reality. Again, acknowledging that there are things that are going to be difficult for people to get used to. It's okay to acknowledge that. It's okay to acknowledge that sometimes the open environment, the shared space environment, is going to save the company money. That is not a bad thing. It's also an opportunity to share with your employees that, yes, we are going to save money because we're reducing a whole floor of our office environment, and that's going to allow us to get the laptops that you want. It's going to allow us to do some of these other things that you've been wanting. So part of it is communicating in the way you say it. But looking at best practices and preparing for the open plan, what I wanted to do was bring up sort of what's next for Stegmeier Consulting Group in our research. We're coming out with an app that's going to help drive some of these behaviors in shared space environments so that people are prompted to find different spaces. So what we're looking to do is to be able to do before and after workplace change studies to see how well people are using the new environment and how well that space is supporting their productivity depending on the task they're doing. So what we're trying to do is help people understand that a work task is simply a single slice of their workday. So for example, we hear this a lot, that managers that have private offices and are going to be losing their private offices will debate and just say, I need to keep my private office. I perform employee reviews once a year for my 8 people. Yet we're going to give you a space all year when you're traveling and you're elsewhere on site. So part of your time is private. Part of the time may be confidential information. A lot of the times it may be working with your colleagues in a more collaborative fashion. So you need to look at your workday in slices. Different tasks need to be supported by different type of workspace settings. It's an education process. We conduct a lot of training for our clients in terms of helping people understand this is why the space was designed this way. Here's how you use this. Here's what you don't want to do. The example I just used, not all work is private. There's different degrees of privacy. There's different degrees of requirements for acoustics too, depending on what the task is. So what we're trying to educate people is the onus is on the individual to seek out the type of space that's best suited for the task at hand. Whether the work is going to be done with others or by yourselves, the type of degree, the degree of privacy required. We see that in many cases where companies complain that their space is underutilized, and you'll see that 2 people need to meet to talk about something, and they'll go in a conference room that's built for 24 people. Well, the space is being used, but it's not fully utilized because they're taking up space. They should be looking for a space that would suit 2 people. So those kinds of things help people understand, why would you select different types of spaces? And lastly, organizations need to tap into key intrinsic motivators. So again, we're looking at changing behaviors. It's helping to elevate the sense of autonomy. I can choose my work settings. Unfortunately, in a lot of organizations, people don't feel they have the license to move around in a shared space environment. The culture is such that they don't feel like they're allowed to. Yet the company has invested in this wonderful new space not being used. Another motivator, mastery. I can improve my productivity. Well, if you've got the opportunity to choose a place to work based on, gee, my energy level's high, I'm going to work here, or I feel like I need a little more stimulation, let me go choose a place by the daylight. You can have more control over your outcomes for your job. Purpose. I can make a difference on my team. So much is focused on team performance. So to be able to have a choice of places to do it, have the freedom to say, hey, let's go sit out on the terrace. I mean, many organizations are developing some fabulous places where people can work out on the patio, under the trees. Yet if you're sitting at your one space because you're afraid your boss is going to, think you're not working, it's like, what a waste. Also focusing on progress. I can achieve the goals of my job. I can see that I'm making progress on that report I'm working on because I found the space that was best suited to do that. And then lastly, social interaction. I can connect with others. We don't want people to feel isolated and depressed, as we saw in some of the, the other side effects of different environments. The social interaction is wonderful. It's being able to turn it off when you need to, because you don't always want to be in a quiet environment. You probably don't always want to be in a social environment. It's got to be that balance. I would invite you to stay in touch. Have made some wonderful connections here at the conference. Also, there are a couple of recent white papers that you might be interested. You can just send me an email and we'll get that off to you. One of them is Selling Upward, Securing Leadership Buy-in for Workplace Change, and Communicating Workplace Change, starting with the basics. Would love to share this with you if you're interested. Any questions?
Questions for Diane? First, a big applause.
Oh. Thank you.